who are here that we're going to get going. Please let me know if you're having trouble hearing. We're getting used to this sound system. Some of us may be speaking too close to the mic. So if you're having trouble hearing, please wave at us and let us know. To let you know that there's signs in the washroom for where the washrooms are. You just go out and you can find some signs because they're actually pretty far from here. We don't have water, but we do have, there are water fountains in the school, so you can find those. So we're going to get going. I would like to start by, of course, acknowledging that we are on Atikameksheng, Anishinaabe territory, Robinson Huron Treaty. We are here today because there is a proposal to, there is a proposal to bring a smelter over here to Coniston, ferrochrome smelter. I will go into a lot of information about that because that's exactly what this session is about. We're not having a debate here, we're having an information session to find out what we need to know as citizens about this proposal. So the way that we've organized this is we have two panels. Well, one person on the panel, the other person hasn't showed up yet, but I'm sure she will. So to set the scene, we would like to open it up with community concerns, okay, which is of course completely rational. As community members, we need to know what's going on in our community. So we thought that the way to open this up would be to start with looking at what some of the community concerns are, what some of the community members might think some of the benefits are, just to start us going. So for this first panel, we had invited the city of Sudbury, and they have refused at this time to come on the panel. We also invited Atikameksheng Anishinaabe, and at this time they've also refused to come on, not refused, but they cannot come to this panel at this time. So, after we've listened to the community panel, we will then go on to listen to some scientific experts who will be able to tell us a little bit more about what this is, and what we're looking at. And then we're going to have two other experts in environmental assessments, in how community members can get involved in trying to assess whether or not a proposal is right for their community or not. Okay? At the same time, we have, okay, great. Okay, at the same time, we encourage you to think of your questions and the questions that you're going to have for us. So if you have a question, please lift your hand up even while the panelists are talking. Right? We have runners. And we have runners who will come to you with a sheet of paper that you can write your question on, give it back to, and then when you're finished writing your question, just wave the paper up and somebody will come and pick it up. And at the end of the panel's presentations, we will ask those questions. Now, if you want to ask the question, we have microphones here, you just put that on your sheet of paper that you want to be the one to ask the question. If you don't want to ask the question, I can ask the question for you. If you want to be anonymous with your question, you don't have to put your name on the question either. Okay? And obviously, we're trying to make this as informal as possible. I was hoping we could sort of consider it as a kitchen table kind of talk that we're having. Obviously, it's a big kitchen. But I want people to feel comfortable, to ask questions, to contribute. And again, I'd like to reiterate, it's not a debate. We're not going to come out of this with one answer. We're coming out of it, hopefully, with more questions. So, okay? So, I would like to start by introducing our first panel. Okay. So I'm going to introduce Barb Deschamps. Barb Deschamps is a third-generation Coniston resident, a mother and a grandmother. She loves her hometown, and she grew up knowing Coniston and the Wanapitei River. She is a member of No Ferrochrome Sudbury. And I'm going to have to back and forth. First of all, I'd just like to say I'm so happy to see the room full. I wasn't sure how it would go. So it was early, I'm going to read because I'm a little nervous, I don't do this. It was early past February, a Thursday evening, that a press release came out stating Coniston was being submitted as a possible site for our ferrochrome smelter facility the very next day. We had no notice, no warning. We had no say for what was coming to our town, to our home. The thought of my community living under the shadow of a ferrochrome smelter has drained the color from my world. It saddens and it sickens me. Now all I see is my little town living directly under a hexavalent chromium particulate fallout zone. Our whole town, 2,500 of us, our homes, schools, parks, playgrounds, our golf course, our vegetable gardens, my grandchildren, all less than 2.5 kilometers away from the site. We don't need more metal in our environment. We've had enough. The proposed ferrochrome smelter is in no way comparable to Sudbury's existing smelters. This proposed smelter will emit hexavalent chromium. Hexavalent chromium is a carcinogen. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies hexavalent chromium as a human carcinogen. No amount of chromium-6 is safe. Just like lead and asbestos, I do not believe this belongs next to my town or any town. I do not believe any possible benefits can outweigh its risk. I oppose this smelter, not just for me, but for my children and my grandchildren. They are the ones who will be most impacted. It's not right to inflict them with loss of health. It's not right to harm their environment. And it's not right to put this facility in our midst. Our young families will leave. My family will leave. We are people and we live here. We should have a say in what comes to our community, and we should have a right to know what the risks are and decide for ourselves what is safe. Since this has happened, I have heard from other people who also see the risk. Not just Coniston, but for the watershed, for their lakes, for their drinking water, for their health. We all deserve answers to our questions, and we deserve to be part of deciding what belongs in our community and what we can confidently say is safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Next, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Recollet. Stephanie is the Interim Director of Sustainable Development for the Wanapitei First Nation. Her background includes an honors degree in law and justice from Laurentian University and more recently in environmental management. She is also a registered trapper and paddle instructor in her community. And as such, she has a great respect for nature. She understands that healthy lands and waters are directly linked to the preservation of Anishinaabe identity, so she works with governments and industry to minimize environmental impacts from development in First Nation territories.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today in order to provide a perspective from my community, Wanapitei First Nation. We're from the north side of the lake of Wanapitei. So we're, if you look at the watershed, one of our major concerns always with projects coming into our territory is the quality of our water. And obviously we do a lot of participation in early project development in order to stay informed for our community to make the best informed decision making. Some of the benefits, we were able to build our capacity in terms of environmental monitoring with a lot of the industry people who come into our territory. I'll just give a little bit of background about myself, as I'm actually the interim acting director, but my normal capacity is the environmental coordinator. So I do all of our waste diversion, I run our water monitoring programming. I work within, like, I have the forestry file, we work in mining, source water protection. So we're across the board and we're always trying to monitor things that are happening in our territory. So our community is Anishinaabe. We come from the Three Fires Confederacy, which is the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. We're in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, and our community considers the Wanapitei watershed to be our stewardship area, which is where we consider to be have that extra responsibility to make sure that any activities occurring are going to be held but to a very high standard, and make sure that we have those resources available for future generations. We always are thinking 7 generations ahead. So we're thinking of our great-great-great-grandchildren to make sure they have all the access to the clean water and all of the flora and fauna and all the things that they need to access to really carry out their life as an Anishinaabe person. Our identity is intrinsically tied to the land, and in order to carry out our traditional practices, we need to make sure we have a healthy ecosystem. So for us, environmental security is like one of the most important things. So when we look at a project like this, it's very early on, and we haven't had a lot of engagement with, in terms of understanding the science or the project in any real depth, and that's something we're going to be looking into very shortly. But for now, so I'm going to be kind of general about our comments. In terms of economic benefits, which is basically the driver of this kind of project, there's the opportunity for capacity development and jobs. Of course, one of my critiques about a lot of the time when the jobs are promised, when these projects come into our territories, is that there's going to be all these abundance of jobs. But the reality is a lot of our members aren't qualified, and unless there's like the training that comes behind it, it's not really accessible to our people anyways. So if that's the only benefit that we can see, that's something that doesn't really trickle down to us anyways. So we would definitely have to see other benefits besides that. We are currently working on a source protection plan for our community. We have been heavily involved with the source water protection plan for Sudbury. And we are north in the watershed, so I mean, most of what's going to happen usually will go down to the Great Lakes watershed. So the thing is, even though our community is on the north of Wanapitei, we do practice our traditional living still for sustenance, and we do travel the waterways. So we are not limited to our impact of being up there. If anything impacts the water all the way down to the Great Lakes, which is traditionally our ancestral canoe routes, and we still use them today. We're not going to be able to continue doing that if we don't take care of our land and water. I think that's all I'm going to say right now. Okay, miigwech.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so hopefully that's sort of set some of the groundwork for the more detailed questions that we are going to be asking our experts. So I'd first like to start by introducing Stefan Siemann, Dr. Stefan Siemann. He's a full professor of biology at Laurentian University. His research has focused on antibiotic resistance, anthracite and zinc proteins, and most relevant to this discussion, metals in Professor of Chemistry, sorry. Oh my gosh, how did I do that? Professor of Chemistry, sorry.
That's correct.
Metals in biological systems. He has also previously done research on chromium as an essential element. Now, what we've done with our experts is we've asked them specific questions. So I will be repeating the questions. We've asked them to try and answer those questions within 5 minutes, but of course that's kind of difficult sometimes to do. And some of them are answering more than one question together. You know how that happens. So please be patient with us. But we've asked Dr. Stefan Siemann to please set up the proposed project for us, to sort of describe to us what this project is.
Great, thanks, Laurie. So maybe let me start off by saying that, or putting this into a kind of historical context. So So about 10 years ago, 2007 and 8, there was a vast deposit of chromite found in the Ring of Fire, which is in the James Bay lowlands, so about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. And it's one of the largest deposits in the world. And it is the primary source of chromium, which is used for making stainless steel, because stainless steel that we all depend on uses about 15 to 20% chromium, so it's a very high level. So now, what is proposed here, or at 4 cities, including Sudbury, have placed bids to hold or to accommodate a smelter or a ferrochrome production facility. So from the ore, what basically happens, and this is proposed, the ore is supposed to be crushed and further processed up north near the mine. Okay, so it's made into fine powder and then probably delivered by rail, road, or both. And that's when it would go into the northern Ontario city that would be successful in the bidding process. So potentially Coniston, this is the preferred site, I guess, for Sudbury. What would happen here is that this finely crushed ore and other materials, and we're talking considerable amounts of slag building material, reductant, which is typically carbon, have to be shipped here to Coniston. So not just the ore, in fact, large quantities of other things need to be brought here as well. And then here would be the smelter. So what happens essentially is that in a typical type of arc furnace, everything is brought to about 1,600, 700 degrees, and then melted in with the ore, slag building material, and a reductant, so carbon. Now, some of these processes, and this is came through in some of the communications that are circulating, is the potential of chromium-6 release, which, as was mentioned, is highly carcinogenic. Now, after the smelting is done, there's essentially a few things that you get. One is ferrochrome. So ferrochrome is an alloy of iron and chromium that is used for stainless steel making. Slag, which comes off in a liquid form, which has to be cooled. And slag can contain a lot of chromium, in fact. And then you get off gases, some of them quite toxic, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Right. So these processes, the smelting itself, but not the crushing and concentrating of the ore, just the smelting, that is to be performed here or in Thunder Bay, Timmins, or who else, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, exactly.
Okay, so you sort of touched there on the waste products that are generated by production and associated activities, so that's okay. So what happens to the chromium once it is in the air, water, or soil?
So that is quite a tricky question, because chromium is actually quite dynamic, and it comes in different forms. So in the stainless steel or in the ferrochrome, we call it chromium 0, it's just metallic. But in the environment, it would be in 2 forms, potentially chromium 3 or chromium 6, which is the hexavalent chromium. Now, in the environment, the chromium 3 predominates. So that's considered the definitely less toxic form of chromium. But during atmospheric processes, one can be converted into the other and backwards. And that depends on a lot of different conditions. For example, in soil, it's the pH of the soil, the temperature, humidity, moisture content of the soil, whether there's manganese oxides present. So some of these factors can promote hexavalent chromium formation. Others actually do it the other way. they promote hexavalent chromium going to chromium-3, which is much, much less toxic.
Okay, thank you. And how do local conditions, we're thinking of Sudbury and Coniston in particular, affect what happens to the chromium once it is in the environment?
So basically, in Sudbury, because of all the mining activities that we've had here, there's a relatively high level of manganese, or brownstone. It's manganese oxide. And brownstone is known to react with the chromium-3, which is more harmless, to chromium-6. So we have elevated levels of manganese here in Sudbury. In terms of the pH, our soils are a little bit more acidic here. That actually is more to the benefit of the chromium-3 getting rid of chromium-6, although there are some other reports that kind of say the opposite. But in general, chromium-6 is favored under alkaline conditions, so high pH conditions. Our soil is more of lower pH.
Thank you very much. And obviously, if you still have questions, please think of your questions and raise your hands, and somebody will come to you with some paper and you can ask your questions. If you're not comfortable writing the questions down, after we've finished with the panel, I'll give you a chance. You can raise your hand and you can just ask your questions verbally, okay? But that's after the panel is finished, okay? We're going to go through the whole panel first. So if you want a piece of paper, okay, thank you. Okay, next speaker is Dr. Charles Ramcharan. He's an associate professor in the School of the Environment at Laurentian University. He's also a member of the Valley Living with Lakes Center. He's an aquatic ecologist and has done a lot of work on the impacts of industrial damage on lake food webs. Welcome, thank you. So the first question we have for Dr. Ramcharan is, looking at the proposed location and the watershed, where will the chromium end up?
Okay, the release, the way that material can be released from the smelter would be through ash. That's one method, and that of course would be transported by air, so that the predominant wind direction in Sudbury is towards the northwest, or northeast, sorry, so the ash would follow the same direction as what we had before with the release of sulfur dioxides back in the days when the place was getting fumigated. So it'll fall on the same landscape in that direction. In terms of anything released in water or on the soil that will percolate into the water, then it'll end up going towards the Wanapitei River drainage basin. If the site is further north in Moose Mountain, then it'll end up in the Spanish drainage basin. It's a matter of how much is released, and that's the big question. Oh, sorry, in terms of particulars, the chromium ultimately will end up bound to soil particles, so whether this is soil on the landscape or it's soil that's in the sediment of lakes and rivers, it'll end up there. And if you wait for thousands of years for the glaciers to come back, it'll get pushed into the ocean, and that's the ultimate pool where it'll collect.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up. When you say how much, do we have any sense of how much at this point?
That's a really big question. It's, as Stefan was saying, it's really important to know not just how much, but also the form of the chromium and the fate of it if it's in the landscape. So it's a bit of a slippery fish in a sense, because it can convert between the really toxic form like chromium-6 and chromium-3, which is a little bit more benign. In fact, chromium-3 is actually required in micronutrient levels by plants and animals like us. And chromium is a funny thing, because as far as I know, it's the only metal that's regulated with two different standards. So there's a standard for chromium-3, and there's a much lower standard for chromium-6, because it's so much more toxic. Yeah, but it will end up, if there's any release, it matters not just how much, but what form it's in, and the conditions, the environmental conditions that are going to allow it to convert from chromium-3 to chromium-6, which is what we're really worried about. And yes, we do have a lot of manganese here. On the other hand, we have more acidic waters. So that those two tend to work in opposite directions. In terms of finding out what the ultimate effect would be, I think at some point we really need a local experiment. You know, under controlled conditions and find out what the impacts really will be.
Okay, so I guess that sort of answers the next question. Looking at the proposed location, what are the ecological impacts of chromium and the hexavalent chromium?
Okay, so ecological impacts. If people are considered part of that question, chromium, the sources for chromium are not just mining and smelting, but are also released from people in industries that are working with any dyes. So leather is a big source, leather working. Fabric dyeing is another big source of chromium release. So from these industries we know that the stuff is, chromium-6 release is carcinogen, and it also causes liver damage and stuff like that. The same effects happen in mammals and fish and invertebrates, because the chromium-6 works the same way. It destroys proteins, it can destroy DNA, and it damages the lipid membranes on cells, so it can get into cells a lot more easily than chromium-3 can. One funny thing about chromium, it doesn't seem to, most studies show it doesn't accumulate in an organism, so it doesn't bioaccumulate struggling up the food web as things like mercury. So what organisms, the level inside organisms is what they're taking up from the environment directly.
You were also asked to talk a little bit about what we know about the ecological impacts around the facility in Tornio.
Yeah, so there are ferrochrome smelters and chromium mining around the world. The biggest operation is in South Africa, but there are also, I think, smaller operations in India and I think Pakistan, I'm not sure. In those sites, there has been some considerable environmental contamination. I don't know if those countries have the same environmental regulations and standards that we have. Those mines also are a lot older than what we have in Finland. So Finland, in Tornio, that site, it was built, I think it started to be built in the 60s and 70s, and in an industrialized country that was a leader in environmental concerns, the regulations were different and the plant was built to different standards. The other reason that site is important is because it's a soft water site, so it's granitic rocks, so it's more similar to Sudbury. And in that habitat, there has been some, what they've done is a survey of Finland to look at surface waters and groundwaters, and surprisingly there are some, maybe not hot spots, but there are some places where chromium has been found at elevated levels, but they weren't at the mines, which is kind of interesting. If you look at uptake in things like biota that are more persistent on the landscape, like moss and trees and things like that, the mines did seem to have some impact. So on the barks of pine trees, I think it was, there were elevated levels of chromium. There's surprisingly little information. You know, if I look up effects on mercury or something like that, or copper, you get stacks of papers. But for chromium, not that much. But what we do know is that even in a well-regulated site, there was a little bit of release, enough to be measured.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to now be moving on to the health effects of this proposal, or the potential health effects. And so I'd like to bring Liza into this part. So I'd like to introduce Liza. Liza Vandermeer has been a working environmentalist all of her adult life. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the Peace Award for Exemplary Service. Although now retired from the Ministry of the Environment, she generously shares her in-depth knowledge and experience of environmental standards, regulations, assessments, and law.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have to give me a question.
Let's start with the question. Okay, what is the environmental review? No, sorry. What are the health impacts of chromium and hexavalent chromium?
Well, as the previous two speakers have addressed, chromium is a fairly common element, and it's got a fairly complicated chemistry. So the form of chromium that has health impacts is chromium, hexavalent chromium, which is an ion. It's certainly, there seems to be a lot of documentation about the health impacts from chromium-6. And as we've heard the previous speakers refer to, I've certainly been involved with historic sites where chrome was used in leather tanning and so on. And there were very long-lasting impacts from that industry, partly because there was very little regulation at the time that those industries were started. So that there are certainly adverse impacts, and they can stick around for a long time when there is high levels of contamination. We do know that hexavalent chrome is a carcinogen, and I have to say that there's some really good fact sheets that Coalition for Liveable Sudbury has pulled together. So certainly if people have had a chance to look at those, I can answer specific questions. Part of the thing about any environmental contaminant is that the toxicology, which is basically the science of looking at human health impacts or impacts on other organisms, it ties into what levels people or animals are being exposed to. And you can have acute effects or chronic effects. So acute effects are usually experienced when there's really high level of exposure, and it can cause quite severe immediate impacts. So somebody might have trouble breathing, or a skin reaction. And we know that can be associated with exposure to hexavalent chrome. Chronic exposure would be more what a worker might be exposed to if they're working in a facility dealing with chrome over many years. And chronic effects are what we associate with cancer, possibly impacts on reproductive ability, or sort of long-term chronic health conditions that develop after exposure over a long time. Public Health Ontario, which is a very reputable public agency that pulls together research that's been done in the whole scientific field, has prepared a summary fact sheet on the impacts of exposure to hexavalent chrome. As previous speakers have said, there's been a lot of exposure or experience dealing with ferrochrome smelters in South Africa, Kazakhstan, and I believe possibly Pakistan as well. We do know that in comparison to Canada, South Africa and Kazakhstan have very minimal environmental regulations, environmental protection policies, or enforcement. Worker health and safety is not considered to be an important priority in those countries, unfortunately. So the research that has been done has shown that people in those areas can have serious impacts just because where ferrochrome smelters exist, the environmental impacts are pretty much uncontrolled. By comparison, Finland, which is a Nordic country, has a history of very good environmental protective policies and guidelines, and in general, society in the Nordic countries accepts the fact that environmental regulations are a cost of doing business. People know that when you live in Finland, there are environmental guidelines, regulations, enforcement. The government does that, society accepts it, and industry accepts it. Canada is kind of not as bad as South Africa, but probably not as advanced as Finland. So, you know, it also, we just know that, and I can say, speaking from personal experience, although the Ministry of the Environment does its best, it's severely under-resourced, understaffed, and it is subject to political interference. So even people who know that their jobs are to make sure that the regulations are observed and that good science is practiced, they can give their advice, but they don't have control over the final decisions. And industry lobbies pretty hard, and political decisions are often based on not necessarily the best environmental science.
So I was wondering if Dr. Siemann had anything to add about the health benefit and health issues.
Just actually crossed my mind, maybe a clarification in terms of the hexavalent chromium, because some of you might be familiar with the Aaron Brockovich story, have seen the movie and are aware of what happened in California, and maybe associating this with chromium-6. There's different types of industries that deal with chromium. One is the industry that deals actually with chromium-6 and makes chromium-6 and uses it, which is, as you mentioned, leather tanning. When you think of previously the pressure-treated wood contained chromium as well. I mean, that's being phased out, which is a good thing. Paints, lacquers, all those things actually can contain hexavalent chromium. And if this leaks into the environment or is not managed properly, as in the Aaron Brockovich story, which had tanks where chromium-6 was specifically added to the water to kind of provide corrosion resistance, and if something breaks and it's not lined and it gets into the environment, gets into the groundwater, that's what happened in California. That's when main problems with health issues arise. The industry related to chromite and ferrochrome production is kind of the other way. It deals with chromium-0, chromium-3. So although chromium-6 can be produced, it's not the focus of the industry. So it's much less toxic. So there's two different types. And I think that's probably good to know that there's these two different types of industries. So this one here in Sudbury does not focus on chromium-6. It's not their intention to make it, but it could be produced as a byproduct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now this sort of gives us a sort of idea of some of the technical issues and then the health issues and the chemical issues that we're going to be looking at. So now I'd like us to turn to what can we do as citizens? How can we respond to some of these concerns? So for the next section, we're going to be going back and forth between Liza and Brené Lloyd. So I'd like to introduce Brené Lloyd. Brené Lloyd is a community organizer and project coordinator with Northwatch. It's a regional coalition of environmental and social justice groups in northeastern Ontario. And Brené just told me that it's 30 years old now, so Northwatch has been around for a while trying to protect our environment. Brené works primarily as a researcher, writer, and organizer around land use and natural resource concerns, and has served in a number of key advisory positions on mineral and forest policy. She has been case manager and coordinator for environmental reviews of numerous natural resource management, waste, and energy projects undertaken under federal and provincial environmental assessment laws or before electricity or nuclear licensing tribunals. So she obviously knows her stuff. So we're going to start asking Brené, what is the environmental review process that will be required before this plant comes to Coniston?
So we don't know.
So there are two different kinds of environmental assessment. There's provincial environmental assessment and federal environmental assessment. There are also environmental assessments done in a sort of a claiming the term but not really following the practice, that you might see other reports that are called environmental assessment reports. They might be reports describing something related to environmental effects, but I'm talking about capital E, capital A environmental assessments. So federally, for this project to go through an environmental assessment, we're in a bit of a wait and see, because the Federal Environmental Assessment Act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, is going through review, and there's an act before Parliament right now, and under that act there will be a regulation, and the regulation will be an update from the current regulation. It's called, sometimes we usually call it the project list. It's actually called the regulation designating physical activities. And on the current project list, this project would be exempt. We hope that won't be the case in the revised one. There's a June 1st deadline, and I would encourage you all to even write a very brief letter saying, make sure that a smelter like this is caught by the project list. But what goes through federal environmental assessments, it's somewhat constrained by what's within the federal government's decision-making. What do they issue permits or approvals for? Nevertheless, I think that we would expect this project to be subject to a federal environmental assessment. But it's a wait and see whether this government undoes some of the damage the previous government did to the federal environmental assessment process. Within federal environmental assessments, then you can either get what used to be called a comprehensive study, and basically it's sort of a paper chase. There's lots of reports issued, and as the public we can read them and comment on them, and a decision will be made taking those comments into effect. Tend to be harder to affect a project through that kind of an environmental assessment. Then there's also panel reviews, where you actually have a hearing and a usually 2 or 3 person panel, sometimes larger. And those are processes that we can engage in. We put the proponent puts things in writing, we put things in writing, and so on. That's the federal environmental assessment process. Then provincially, there's a Provincial Environmental Assessment Act. But the Provincial Environmental Assessment Act applies mostly just to what's called public sector projects, things that government is doing. The Minister of the Environment has the power to designate any project for an individual environmental assessment. And that's what we want. We want this project designated for an individual environmental assessment under the Provincial Environmental Assessment Act. And we want that because in many practical ways, it's a stronger act. If we actually get a hearing under the Provincial Act, we have more rights. We can ask questions directly in the hearing. We can put in written questions and they have to answer them. If they don't answer them, then we can bring a legal motion to get them answered. It's a stronger act. That said, we've never had a mine or a mining project designated by an individual environmental assessment for an individual environmental assessment in Ontario. We have had some that have been made, at least in name, a joint federal-provincial, but we tend to lose those really helpful rights, information rights that we have in the Provincial Act when it's joined with the federal. So there are opportunities. There's maybe, even if we work really hard, a likelihood that we'll get an environmental assessment, but it's not a certainty yet at this point.
Thank you, Brene, and I think you also answered, is it possible for an environmental assessment to occur, unless you want to add something, Liza?
It's possible.
No, that's okay. Okay, and I think that it's important to mention here that the city has said that Noront is committed to doing a comprehensive environmental assessment.
That might be a small in the small.
Okay. So we'll get into that in a minute. So the next question is for Liza, and it's what regulations and guidelines are there currently for chromium?
Well, specifically, not specifically for chromium, but this type of proposal falls under a lot of different provincial legislation. One thing that I'd like to point out, in addition to the Liveable Sudbury fact sheet, is that the Ministry of Northern Development and Mines has jurisdiction over this project under the Mining Act, because the smelter is related to mining activity. So there would have to be a closure plan associated with the smelter, and similarly any of the slag and the waste associated with the process would be picked up by the Mining Act closure plan requirements. So those wastes would not necessarily fall under the Ministry of the Environment's legislation. So what does fall under the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change, as a general overall rule, any industrial activity which is causing a discharge to the natural environment is regulated. So for example, under the Environmental Protection Act, there's going to be air emissions from this proposed smelter. The proponent would have to apply for an environmental compliance approval for air emissions. If there are any discharges to the water, they would have to apply for an environmental compliance approval for the industrial sewage works. That's under the Ontario Water Resources Act. If they need to draw water for the process, either from wells or from surface water, they'd have to apply for a permit to take water if they're using more than 50,000 liters a day. And in addition, if there are wastes that aren't picked up under the Mining Act, so any wastes aside from the slag and so on, there would need to be they would have to, so for example, liquid industrial wastes, they'd have to be registered as generators of those wastes, and they would need to comply with requirements under the Environmental Protection Act as well. So I think when Renee and I were driving over, we thought that it would probably make sense if Renee sort of picked up the public consultation aspects of applying for environmental compliance approvals, because in Ontario, the Environmental Bill of Rights has specific public consultation and comment aspects, and Renee, and that would be very, very important for this group to be aware of, because there are opportunities for concerned citizens to participate. So we thought Renee should probably talk about that. The biggest issue in connection with the smelter would be the environmental compliance approval for the air emissions. The reason that that's a really complex, huge issue is that air is a complicated aspect to regulate, because you can't just go and grab a grab sample of air and know what's in it. It's not the same as taking a sample of something coming out of a pipe. For the environmental compliance approval, the proponent would have to do what they call an emissions summary and dispersion model, which is a really, really, really complicated computer model. Basically, they're taking all kinds of factors, plugging them in, and coming out with a theoretical answer to how much is going to be discharged, what the impacts might be. It's not something that is readily understood by a layman. I worked for the ministry for 30 years and it still confused the heck out of me. So it's the kind of thing that the consultants do the work on. As I say, it's a very hypothetical modeling exercise, and the enforcement and the compliance is tricky because the ministry doesn't have the resources to actually check for compliance. So the onus is on the industry to do their own monitoring and report back. So again, it's sort of the big black box. From the point of view of industrial sewage works, from my read of the preliminary description of the project, it doesn't sound as if there's going to be a lot of liquid discharges, because they're talking about a closed loop where they're trying to reuse as much of their processed water as possible, which is quite common in mining exercises or mining activities. It's a good thing. It means that they're actually accountable for cleaning the water themselves. There probably would be some kind of tailings area, which again would fall under the Mining Act. If there were a catastrophic failure, a spill, some kind of a process upset, that does fall under the Environmental Protection Act as well. There's something called the Spills Bill, or it's part 10 of the Environmental Protection Act, which basically says that if anything happens that causes a discharge which is outside of the ordinary, that ministry has to be notified, and the industry responsible for the activity has to do everything they can as quickly as possible to contain and ameliorate the impacts. But if you're talking about some kind of a catastrophic spill or a catastrophic air discharge, obviously there's not a lot you can do once whatever has entered the air. You just have to wait for it to blow over, which is not a desirable situation at all. They are supposed to do contingency planning, but we all know that human beings are fallible. You can plan something to the nth degree, and there's always going to be the spanner in the works, something that's going to happen that nobody anticipated.
Okay, and the other question that we asked you to think about is if there are any other ferrochrome smelters in North America, Canada, Ontario, and if not, what are the risks of being first?
Well, that's certainly a good question. No, there are no other ferrochrome smelters in Ontario, none in Canada, and Renee and I were just discussing, we're pretty sure there aren't any in North America. The perils of being first are, the government operates on the principle of developing policies to address known concerns and then implementing those policies. When something's the first of its kind, talking about human fallibility, you can never anticipate everything that might go wrong. There aren't policies in place necessarily to address all aspects of it, so there's sort of some aspects of it they're going to be making it up as they go along. There's a very well-established field of science on air modeling, air quality modeling and dispersion and so on, but specifically related to chrome and the chromium-3 and chromium-6, not so much. So in that scenario, we've seen that that the politicians from Sudbury have been talking a lot about the Finnish operation. The difficulty being that our legislation isn't the same as the Finnish legislation. We can learn from what was going on in Finland, and we can learn what is going on in international science, but it has to fit into our Canadian Ontario regulatory system. So that's where there are shortcomings to not having any precedent within our regulatory regime.
Thank you. Okay, now the last question for the panel, but I'm going to be going back to the panel for other things, but is for Renee, and it is basically asking what should citizens be aware of in participating in an environmental assessment, and just a few kind of lead questions to that. What expectations should citizens have in participating? How can they participate most effectively? And do environmental assessments look at if a project should proceed and or how to mitigate impacts of a project? That's a lot.
Yes. Thanks, Laura. I might have to look at my piece of paper a few times. So what you should be aware of going in, they're really hard work. They're a lot of work. Participating in environmental assessment is hard work, but it's good work and it's important work. It's a good way to build, often participating in environmental assessments actually builds community. because you're sharing the work, and you must share the work. Environmental assessments generally are quite broad. They cover a lot of areas, environmental, social, industrial, the technical details of how a project is going to go forward. And it's really important that you share that work. And it doesn't, we sort of do at the beginning of many of these processes, kind of do almost like a gaps analysis. Who's covering what? And what still needs to be covered, and how are we going to do that? And it often involves prioritizing. Sometimes you can't cover everything, but the public participation is very important. And depending on the process, you might get some resources to be able to, through participant funding programs, to be able to hire some experts. You might be able to fundraise to hire some experts. You might have some pro bono experts, experts who will just help you because they share your concern. And it's really important to have that combination of public, community, direct input, and expert involvement, expert input. And I think that we really have to have confidence in ourselves as citizens, as lay people, that we can understand these technical issues and that we have something to say. And we can get experts to help us, but we have important things to say. Early involvement is very important. Get in at the beginning. And sustained engagement is very important. You're going to go in at the beginning and you're going to be there till after the end. And success often comes outside the environmental assessment process, but I believe that that success that comes outside the environmental assessment process came because we engaged in the environmental assessment thoroughly and effectively. And we really need to protect ourselves against anybody ever saying, well, you could have had your say, and you didn't. At the same time, sometimes people have good reasons for not participating. And you might, in the course of getting ready and going through an EA, there may be some who say, I'm going to take a position outside that formal process for these reasons. And that doesn't mean that that they're saying anything against the people who are participating in the process. They're in fact relying on you to do that. We can be very diverse in our messages, diverse in our approaches, but vote early, vote often, get in early, stay in long. There are, such different standards and such different styles of environmental assessments that it's a bit hard to generalize overall about how you participate and what to expect. There's even a diversity of style in hearing panels. And so as you go in, just keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay tuned. Well, I was in an environmental assessment hearing a few years ago that went on. It was extended and extended and extended again. And we realized that the panel chair responded more favorably to some people than to others. Unfortunately, she wasn't that keen on me. And you have to just go with that. You have to read the room and keep working and reworking your strategy as you go through. Now I'm going to look at the piece of paper because I think Liza's reminding me to talk about the EBR. So what kind of decision will they make at the end? Unfortunately, right now, the federal decision is a fairly weak framework. We see at the end of federal environmental assessments these outcomes that say the project is unlikely to cause significant adverse effects, mitigation measures being taken into consideration. That's not very comforting. It's unlikely to cause really significant effects. The new act, we'll see, the language looks a little bit better, and it's a bit more hopeful. The decision test for the revised federal act is going to look at the extent to which the project contributes to sustainability. I'll shorten this number 2 up, but it's basically the extent to which the adverse effects are adverse. So are they a little adverse or really adverse? How much can mitigation, so mitigation is things that can be done to lessen the negative effect. Other different ways of doing it, and so on. How much can the mitigation measures reduce those effects? The impact of the project on Indigenous peoples, and then the extent to which the effects of the designated project hinder or contribute to the Government of Canada's ability to meet its environmental obligations and its commitments in respect of climate change. And I think that is the most hopeful single subsection in the entire new act. So we'll see. Of course, there's still the hard work of actually getting it designated, but those are the kinds of decision tests that the federal minister will be using at the end. Most environmental assessments, most federal environmental assessments are approved. And there are terms and conditions applied. And it's a really tough thing to think about at the beginning of an environmental assessment process that you are passionately opposed to. It's really tough to think about the terms and conditions you want to have applied that might make it not quite as harmful. It's tough to do that, but it is something that is worth doing. In part, it's something worth doing because it's, reducing harm is second best to avoiding harm, but it's still reducing harm. But also, it's worth doing because sometimes those terms and conditions can be, if you can get terms and conditions that are actually going to protect the environment, those terms and conditions might cause the proponent to lose interest in their project. In the Energy East review, that was our strategy from the beginning. We didn't think the National Energy Board would ever say no, but if we could get terms and conditions that would actually protect the environment, we thought TransCanada would lose interest. And the same might be the case here. So it's a tough thing to do, to be thinking about that, but it is something that I would encourage you to do because you're going to try, when you're in an environmental assessment process or any of these processes, you're trying to move whatever you can to get as close as you can to your desired outcome, which is protecting your community, protecting the environment, and in some cases, stopping a project. Environmental assessments don't ultimately do that. Ultimately, it's a political decision to stop or allow the project to proceed. Was that all my questions? EBR. So, Liza's reminding me about, so the Environmental Bill of Rights, so I think it's in the City of Sudbury page, they outline the sequence of decision making. And they put environmental assessment before the permitting process, that is how it usually goes. One of the problems with that is sometimes the proponent is much vaguer in their project at the environmental assessment stage and then changes the project when it gets to the permitting stage. So sometimes you're dealing with multiple versions of the same project and you have to learn the project again. But when you get, one of the benefits of participating in the environmental assessment process is knowing that that permitting stage is coming. And knowing that if you're not successful in getting the environmental assessment decision that you want, you can bring that knowledge and bring that information that you worked hard to gather in the environmental assessment stage to the environmental permitting stage. So the environmental permits that Liza has outlined, we do have an opportunity to comment on that. There's something called the Environmental Bill of Rights Electronic Registry. And so a permit, the ones Liza described, are called instruments. So they're posted and you've got anywhere from 30 to 90 days to comment on those. And you put your comments in writing, but then you have an opportunity to appeal. It's tough to get an appeal. And what you're appealing is you're actually requesting leave to appeal. You're asking for the chance to have a second consideration. But under the Environmental Bill of Rights, you also, so those are the permitting processes. And so you can then use the information and the knowledge you gained in the environmental assessment process to effectively, review and comment on those permits. And the province is a real decision maker, and so those permits make the real decisions about what harm is going to be permitted. There are also under the Environmental Bill of Rights two other tools which don't get used that often, but which might be very helpful in this case. One is you can appeal a decision made by the Ministry of the Environment. And there have to be certain criteria for that, but you can appeal a decision that's made. The other, and particularly given that we are moving into a project review for which Ontario has no experience and no track record, you can actually request a review of a standard or a regulation under the Environmental Bill of Rights. These are things we'll probably come back to later on, further down the road, when the project is a little more defined and probably after the environmental assessment process. But those are important tools that you might want to use under the Environmental Bill of Rights.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now our heads are filled with all of this information. So I'm sure that you have questions. One of the things I'd like to mention is that there will be a follow-up session tomorrow at 1 o'clock for anybody who's interested in following up with some of this information and organizing if you want to, or just asking more questions of each other or whatever. We will be here tomorrow at 1 o'clock, so if you want to come for that. So I am now going to start taking some of the questions, and I'll start with this one. So this is a question for Brene. So Coniston is on or for anybody who can answer this actually, because it's a technical question as well. Coniston is on an M3 brownfield industrial zone. Will environmental assessments be more lenient because of this?
They shouldn't be. Although I'm going to actually pass it to Liza because she knows the brownfields rules much better than I do. But they shouldn't be, because you're assessing a project. It shouldn't be allowed to be more harmful just because there's already harm in place. But I'm going to pass it to Liza.
Yeah, so if we're looking at, so brownfields legislation basically recognizes that where industrial activity has occurred in the past, that the site's been impacted. And so over time, it mostly lies with municipal affairs and housing. What they've been trying to say is that we should be trying to focus industry on industrial sites and not keep taking over pristine woodlands or pristine farmland and build new industry there, which in theory is good. From the point of view of the brownfields legislation, the major implication is going to be what the existing soil contamination is. In an area where there has been smelting in the past, obviously there's going to be impacts to the soils, and so it means that basically a proposed activity doesn't have to, they're going to have to look at risk assessments to see if they're going to actually make the existing contamination any worse. It also addresses the idea of cumulative impacts, so over time different activities are going to sort of, it's like a Jenga, you're piling one effect on top of another effect, and that might be addressed in the terms of an EA. I think the one thing that occurs to me, though, in the context of the Coniston site, there is a residential area very close to the proposed site of the smelter, and from an air emissions perspective, impacts on the closest receptor, which are kind of called point of impingement. If there's a sensitive receiver within a certain area, residential area, schools, nursing homes, hospitals, that actually has an effect on the air approvals process. So, for example, if you compare the Coniston site to the site up near Timmins that they're looking at as well, which is the old Kid Creek smelter, it's a huge, huge brownfields area, quite far away from the community. It's downwind of Timmins, and there's no residential housing in the immediate vicinity. Clearly, those are going to be different factors. Coniston would be considered differently than the Kid Creek site would be.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, this question is around environmental assessments. So how can we help to ensure the project is designated to an individual environmental assessment or provincial environmental assessment as opposed to a federal environmental assessment?
A decision to designate as an individual environmental assessment is made conceptually by the Minister of the Environment, but practically it would be made by Cabinet. So it might be a good thing to talk about between now and June 7th with the provincial election coming. I think saying so, the proponent has said they're going to do a comprehensive environmental assessment. We don't know what they mean by that. We can expect that they don't mean an individual environmental assessment under the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act, but I think that we should be pressing the provincial government to commit to an individual environmental assessment act. Under the federal legislation, there is the opportunity for a strategic environmental assessment. Given everything that's going on or potentially could go on in the James Bay lowland, particularly in the area they call the Ring of Fire, a strategic environmental assessment under the Federal Act would make good sense. Because we've got, right now, different proponents proposing different access routes, different infrastructure, different roads, different rails, different processing, different chromite processing facilities. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast. So a federal environmental assessment would be appropriate for a strategic EA and an individual environmental assessment for the specific project, the specific smelter. But we really need to press the provincial government. And during a provincial election, we have more opportunities to do that.
If I could I just wanted to, it just occurred to me, given the fact that this is the first ferrochrome smelter in North America, it might be a very good argument to say this is a very appropriate project to designate for a provincial EA, because we've never done it before in the province, and there isn't a lot of existing policy and so on. So that, it's a very unusual proposal, and there's an argument to be made that in this case it should be designated. I think you could certainly make that, take that stand and push it with the decision makers.
Okay, and a question, I'm not sure who could answer this, but is there any way to push NORAD to participate in a full environmental assessment before they've made their decision?
Under environmental assessments, they're actually going to be required to do something called alternative means. And alternative means is different ways of doing the project, and alternate locations is one of the alternative means. So going back to that idea of a strategic environmental assessment at the sort of the earlier stage, environmental assessment in both the provincial and federal language, they call it a planning tool. But it's actually being used as an approval mechanism. So we should go back to it being used as a planning tool, and a strategic environmental assessment would give us that. They would have to look at different transportation options, the variety of different projects that there's potential for, and different locations, alternate locations for the smelter.
Thank you. And I'm just going through these questions at random. I just want you to know that. And I will go through the questions that I'm asking first, and then I will ask people who've indicated they want to ask their questions up for the next round, if that's okay. Okay. In regard to Tofino, how is the smelter situated, location to community, in comparison to Coniston? Does anybody know that? Where in the yeah. How close it is into the community? No? Yeah, I don't think there's experts here on that. Okay, that's good. Yeah?
I'm just trying to think about what I've read. Renee and I agreed there's something on the Sudbury website, and I think they said that within 2 kilometers that many of the employees actually cycle to work.
Oh, now we're saying 10 kilometers.
10 kilometers, okay, not so much a longer bike ride, but certainly not isolated.
And again, this is about the plant in Finland. So it's a health question. Do we have any information on health impact of smelter workers on the plant in Finland?
Yeah, the research at this point is saying that they're not picking up any impacts on worker health and safety from the Finnish plant, which again is not surprising. Goes back to my point about the Scandinavian countries tend to take a very precautionary approach towards worker health and safety. So as far as I think they were saying that there aren't any studies that have shown any impacts. And normally, even in Canada, we do have pretty good legislation in place about doing baseline studies on workers. You know, you have to do screening, lung capacity and so on, and they are looking at changes over time because of the workman's comp legislation. So I would expect that they have the same precautions in place in Finland.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Stefan. Or anybody, again, if anybody can answer these questions. If something went wrong at the smelter or where they store the hazardous waste, what is the worst thing that could happen to Coniston?
That's a good question. I think one of the main concerns, just in the way the process is run, is probably not the chromium itself. I mean, it's a process that heavily relies on coal or carbon-like products. And in fact, the real ingredient that tackles the chromite and converts it into the chromium or ferrochrome is carbon monoxide. So it's a good thing and a bad thing in terms of the furnace design that the company actually proposes. It's a closed furnace, which actually minimizes chromium 6 production. On the other hand, it's really, there's a kind of a bed of carbon monoxide which lays over the bed of all the raw material, the slag-forming material, and the ore. So carbon monoxide, of course, is toxic. And now the intention is to recycle this carbon monoxide in the sense that you can burn it effectively to produce electricity, in-house heat, hot water, and so forth. And that's being proposed. So that's also kind of a closed loop as well, and it would have to be purified. And Finland is really good at doing that, like purifying the off gases. But again, carbon monoxide could potentially leak. Right? And it's produced in large quantities. So it's a gas that would just escape. That would be not good. It's for the immediate vicinity. In terms of the slag or other waste materials, one thing that's being done is that the hazardous waste is put into kind of slime ponds, they're called. Now they're lined facilities, so nothing should escape, but if there is a problem, then some of the toxic material, and it's not just chromium-6, which is probably low level anyways, but in any type of ore, you have cadmium and mercury and other things there as well. And some of these chemicals are more mobile, so go into the water and can essentially reach the groundwater potentially, and some are just stuck, they don't move, which then would be good in terms of an accident. But those would be the main problems that I would be concerned about, specifically the carbon monoxide, and then any leaching from slime ponds. But they're typically very well managed. And again, Finland, I think, showed the way of how to do it properly. And so far, so good.
So I'm going to keep it over. You want to add something? Okay, then I'm going to keep it on that end to either Charles or Stefan can answer this question. Whether they bring when they bring material to and from the smelter by road or by train, it will go right past Coniston homes and lots of other homes. What are the risks of that?
Yeah. Again, another good question. Because chromium-6 was brought up so much before, I think one of the main problems that the community would face here is maybe not so much the chemical impact and that toxicity is spread by a chromium-6 or carbon monoxide. I think it's the idea of that massive amounts, in the second phase, massive amounts of materials have to be transported here and then shipped elsewhere. Most often in the United States, because they need quite a bit of the ferrochrome. So whether it's by rail or by trucks, that's probably quite a bit of diesel and gasoline exhaust, a lot of noise. Those are things that I think are quite concerning as well. And I think I put maybe one more down here. I think, again, transportation, exhaust, possible accidents, obviously, spills. So these would be definitely things that would impact the community directly, because, again, residential areas are quite close, I guess within 2 kilometers, maybe off the proposed site. So definitely.
So from my experience, that's a really, really good question, because it can have a huge impact on quality of life for nearby residents. Ministry of the Environment would refer to those as NODs, noise, odor, dust, and smoke. And those aspects do get picked up, or they should get picked up under an environmental assessment. However, they don't really get picked up in any other permitting process. So traffic and so on, I think Laurent has sort of addressed the issue of traffic in their preliminary environmental discussion, but there's no legislative requirement for them to actually do traffic studies to look at the amount of truck traffic that's going to be going through. I can't tell you the number of times that we've had industries, that have all their approvals and so on in place, and it's the actual traffic, the yard lights, just the dust of trucks coming and going, and the vibrations that actually have the most impact on local residents. And unfortunately, those don't really get picked up through any of the existing permitting processes. They're supposed to kind of get addressed through municipal zoning, but the site that has been identified by Sudbury is zoned appropriately for the proposed activity. So all those other impacts could quite easily turn into an issue that would need to be addressed by the industry, but there's no specific mechanism by which, concerned citizens can demand that they be addressed.
Thank you. Okay, here's... being the proposed site was an old smelter, I think this is probably similar to the brownfield question. But will there be tests performed to anticipate any negative reactions to existing contaminants in the environmental assessment?
Well, That would probably get addressed. Again, Liveable Sudbury has their fact sheet about existing limits and standards and so on. There are existing soils standards for various compounds, including total chromium and hexavalent chromium, but those aren't enforceable standards per se. So they're one of those things that, one of the factors that get considered when they're issuing air approvals, for example. They'd be looking at the modeling, how much of particulate chromium is likely to be discharged in the air emissions, how far those particulates might be carried, what kind of fallout rate you'd have, and so on. So it's, although there are standards, there's science on it, the process by which those impacts are actually measured or regulated is pretty complex, and it's not really easily accomplished. Yeah, and Renee can talk about this too.
Yeah, so in the context of the environmental assessment, two things specific to this. One is that there are guidelines developed that tell the proponent, in this case NORAD, what information they have to provide in their environmental assessment documents. And those guidelines should say, detailed description of soil conditions and site conditions at the proposed location. If it doesn't, then there's an opportunity to comment on those guidelines and say this absolutely has to be considered. And then within the environmental assessment documents, they also have to describe cumulative effects. So in that section, they would have to document, show that they understand the site, they understand what their releases are going to be, and that they understand what the synergy or the additive effect, what those two things will do when they're put together. So that should be addressed. It's always a question of how well it's addressed, but that's why we participate.
Okay, this should be a very quick question, although there's no such thing, I'm sure. How long are we talking about when we talk about an environmental assessment? What time frame are we talking?
Well, over the last several years, proponents have really pushed the federal government to put strict timelines, and I don't even remember now what the strict timeline is that's being proposed for the newest version of the Environmental Assessment Act, but it doesn't, they never stick within that time anyway. There's something in the EA language, they say the clock stops, and the clock stops when the proponent asks for extra time to respond to an information need or an information item. Generally, I would say figure on it being 3 to 5 years, generally.
Okay. Okay, so I'd now like to start calling people up who've indicated they want to ask their own questions. So I'd like to start with Dan. Dan here. So, did you want your question?
No, it's okay. This is for Stefan. I was wondering if there's any existing studies of the soil around Coniston already for heavy metals and toxins and et cetera, and where would I find that?
I'm really not aware of these studies, but I do imagine that they have existed since this is industrial land. And I'm not sure whether anyone from the environmental aspect can address this, but it's, I imagine there is information on previous smelter sites in terms of what's in the soil.
Yeah, I think the Sudbury soil study covered Coniston quite a bit, so you should be able to get those data. I think they're online still, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add that if you get the local conditions sheet at the back of the room, there is the links to that. and on our website as well. And if you contact us, if you're having trouble looking through, it's a really long document and you need a little assistance finding the Coniston numbers, just contact us and we'll help you navigate that.
Okay, thank you. Cindy. Cindy, would you like to come up? Okay.
I would like to say thank you first to all of you brilliant people for taking time to be here to help all of us. This is not just a Coniston Garrison issue, it's everywhere. So thank you so much, because this matters. One of my initial thoughts are, once the smelter is in operation, it goes without saying, obviously, there will be emissions. To what degree, we have no idea. When would people start seeing symptoms, negative symptoms, the impact on their health? How quickly, I don't know if you know, within, but there are a number of people, myself included, who are seriously compromised already, health-wise, and so a question like this, I think, would be important to be addressed from that perspective. So how quickly, how soon would people start seeing symptoms, negative effects on their personal health once the smelter is in operation?
Sure, I'll try it. I don't think we're talking about releases that are going to have acute impacts. I think if you're looking for chronic impacts, then the study will involve a population, not just individuals. So it'll take a long time for those data to come in and for any potential effects to be seen. Yeah, but I don't think we're talking about releases that are in the range of acute impacts. So you won't see something that happens right away, especially to an individual. And the greatest exposure would maybe to people who are actually working in the plant. So you might see something there first. But as people have been saying, in 2018, it's possible to build a plant where the worker exposure is quite minimal. And so I don't know if we're even anticipating seeing those types of human health effects.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Charles just said. I think for people, like, there are environmental sensitivities, and certainly under the environmental legislation, it's recognized that some people are more sensitive and will react to much lower levels than other people will. I think in this case, it's a really good idea to make sure that you have a healthcare practitioner who is familiar with your particular health concerns, so that if you do start feeling, or if you have a child who's prone to asthma or something like that, so you have somebody who you can trust to go to for care, because it's always better to be able to say, the smelter was constructed, up until this time I haven't had any, health concerns, and under certain climatic conditions, when the wind is from a certain direction or something, I do feel these impacts. And also the local health unit is responsible and accountable for community impacts. So it's the kind of thing where it's really important to keep good records and to make sure that you work with the people who are responsible, like, for your own personal healthcare practitioner, as well as the local health unit.
And I'm so sorry to say, but I'm not quite as confident. I think that we need to, as part of the environmental assessment process, we need to look at case studies that look not only at what might be the best in Finland, but also at what might be the worst. And we need to really look for baseline health studies being done in the community before the project begins. And I'm by no means an expert in this, but this is a problem we have across several sectors, not just the mining and mineral smelting sector. And it's very difficult to link cause and effect, particularly around human health or environmental health. So I think that we should employ, there's a federally endorsed principle called the precautionary principle. And I think the precautionary principle means that we have a very good understanding of present conditions, including health conditions, and that we have a very clear plan for how change is going to be measured. And I don't know how to do that, but that should be one of the goals in the environmental assessment, and as at least a backup option, that's one of the conditions if the project was ever approved. That's an essential condition.
Actually, that does remind me, there's been the Sudbury soils study that was a multi-year project undertaken by many agencies, and that's exactly, I mean, unfortunately, it was sort of locking the door after the horse was gone, but they were doing epidemiological studies. No, they didn't, but they were doing some tissue or hair or something, were they not, on specific? Yeah, okay.
They did do a health risk assessment. It was a modeling exercise, so we actually don't have the epidemiological studies here. So we do have that model on present conditions. I don't know if there's plans to update that in the new emissions.
And that reminds me, thinking of the Sudbury soil study, that another condition would be what's going to be the response if or when health impacts were identified, because the Sudbury soil study, extensive study, no action plan.
Thank you. Okay, and next I'd like to ask Paul Murdoch up. Do you want to?
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask if it's possible to put scrubbers to clean the chromium 3 or chromium 6 out of the stack.
Yes, so that is definitely the intention. So for there's different types of furnaces that are used, and some countries have a preference for one or the other. So what Noron proposes is a kind of a closed system, which is actually quite beneficial in terms of minimizing chromium-6 contamination. And the gases and the dust from the smelter will be wet scrubbed. And that actually leads to very effective removal of the dust. About 99.9% of particulate matter is removed in that step. There's some suggestions in the literature that proposes any type of new facility, production facility, should also have what Finland introduced. It's on top of the wet scrubbing that filters out the dust, is a kind of a sintered plate filter, and that effectively removes chromium particulates. And that's very important because you have to realize when the gas and the dust comes out, the gas is to be burnt for making hot water, electricity, and so forth. So if there's any contaminant in that off gas, any type of chromium could be converted to chromium-6. But with these filter plates, the wet scrubbing filter plates, it's removed, and it's much less of a concern. So it's definitely introduced at the site wherever it's built, wet scrubbing.
Okay, thank you. Does chromium 3 or 6 bind with anything else in our environment?
Natural organic matter that maybe hasn't been brought. Now, my impression is that here in Sudbury, the organic content of the soil due to mining activities is quite low, and there has been some concern in that regard. The fact is that, so the chromium-3 form actually binds to and is kept in the natural organic matter kind of chromium-3 form, and it suppresses chromium-6 formation, so it would be good. Here in Sudbury, the concern might be that there's lower organic content, so therefore any chromium-3 could end up being chromium-6. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think I mentioned before that brownstone or manganese, which we also find here kind of elevated in Sudbury, can convert chromium-3 to 6. Now, the thing is that requires kind of a soluble chromium-3 form that can migrate and then essentially react with the brown stone. But natural organic matter is known to mobilize chromium-3. So it tends to keep it in chromium-3, the less toxic form, but also makes it mobile enough to react with brown stone if abundant, making therefore chromium-6. So it's you're kind of going in circles. But natural organic matter is definitely very important for the geochemical cycle of chromium.
And my last question is, does it form salts that could be soluble in water?
Yes, absolutely. Like the chromium-6 compounds are generally perceived as more soluble, which is correct, and they can migrate in through the soil into different types of waters, groundwater, so there's a potential. There's some chromium-6 salts that are quite insoluble, so they would be just stuck in the soil and they wouldn't move. The same is true for chromium-3 though. It can be insoluble and immobile, like there's hydroxides, especially in more alkaline conditions. But there's also soluble forms, especially with some natural organic matter. So there's salts that are immobile for both chromium-3 and 6, and some that are freely floating.
Thank you, Dr. Stefan.
If I can just add one thing talking about the safety of the plant, something we haven't brought up so far. This plant is going to be built in an age of rapid climate change. And so we have to build to those standards. You can expect wicked ice storms, you can expect power outages, you can expect extreme flooding. If you have material that's outside in a slime pond and it's open, or a tailings pond, you can expect to have that flood. So we have to build to a different level, no matter what happens with this plant, no matter where it's situated. It has to be made to a very different level that we haven't seen yet.
Okay, so we have just a few more questions. We were going to try and finish up the panel at around 5 o'clock and then open it up just to, you can have food, we can talk to the experts, you can find, get your questions asked more personally. But we've got more questions coming up, so we'll try to get, so I'd like to call Tom Price to the mic. I'm going to try and limit your questions to one question each at this point, if possible. And of course, if you have more questions, this is just the beginning, okay? We need to realize that there's, lots more time and questions that need to be answered for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the panel. This has been very good. Just a couple of small corrections, though, of what I heard earlier. While the site here in Coniston is zoned M3, M3 is not an applicable zoning for a smelter. It will require rezoning to an M4 zoning designation. Presumably, when that comes up for rezoning, our councillors will ask for an environmental assessment before approving the rezoning, I would hope. Okay? But it will have to be rezoned to M4. Second one, someone mentioned that there's no other ferrochrome applications in North America. In 1977, I was part of the lead designer on a ferrochrome nickel recycling plant in Elwood City, just outside of Pittsburgh. That plant is still running today, and in fact they are also recovering cadmium today. And I can assure you that the closed furnace is not a magic answer. It does a lot of things for you, but it also produces chromium-3. And that chromium-3, when we did the plant in Pittsburgh, we had to make sure that we combusted the carbon monoxide very early, because at the carbon monoxide combustion temperature of about 2200 degrees C, the fine particles that were involved would convert to chromium-6. In the Tornio plant, the gas, the carbon monoxide that's produced goes through gas cleaning, and it goes into combustion processes for sintering material coming in. It goes into their power generation. But that chromium-3 can convert very easily at those temperatures in an oxidizing atmosphere to chromium-6. So it's not a panacea, okay? And I just wanted to make those two little corrections. As well, someone asked about the length of time we have. For everybody's information, it took 12 years for the Hinkley of Aaron Brockovich fame, for the Hinkley compressor station to reach the point where they had the major problem they have. They ceased putting hexavalent chromium in their cooling water 12 years after they started, and they put a total of 4,500 pounds in. Looking at the Tornio mass balance and adjusting it for what they plan in Coniston, it would take 9 years to reach that same level in Coniston. So we'll get there quicker than that compressor station did. Now, the question I have, and I'm sure you guys both know the answer, am I correct in assuming that at the high temperature in an oxidizing atmosphere that the chromium-6 will be produced from chromium-3? That was really cool.
Yeah, certainly. So whenever you have an oxidizing or in the presence of oxygen, you will get chromium-6, especially at the high temperatures. In some furnaces that are employed in, for example, India, where they have open arc furnaces or semi-closed arc furnaces, that's a bigger problem for sure. Because, again, I mentioned you have all your raw material bed, really, at 2,000 degrees. And then you have a carbon monoxide atmosphere on top. But in an open furnace, there's a lot of oxygen. And so then at that heat, especially at the surface of the raw material, there you can get oxidation and chromium-6 formation, and it's significant.
Yes, and in the plant in Elwood City, it's a closed furnace, but the off gas coming off it, we had to combust to get rid of the carbon monoxide. So.
That's correct, and I think you mentioned something with the dust that's really fine, like micron size. That's definitely a problem because of the higher surface area. So when that is exposed to oxygen, there's much more, conversion of chromium-3 to chromium-6.
Yes, and we ran into that problem as well, in that the 99.9% that we captured was all greater than 0.4 nanometers, or micron, sorry. Yeah. And the rest of what was in there was less than that, and that's what gave us a major issue. So.
Yeah, and that's the main problem. I think that's what the Tornio plan tried to tackle with that extra filter plate that I mentioned.
Very good. Okay, thank you. I'll save my other ones till later.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think there's just a few questions left here, and I think that they've more or less been answered, but if you do feel like your question hasn't been answered, please come up afterwards and talk to the panelists, because we will be here for another hour afterwards. I just would like to make a few more announcements before I ask the panel a final question. So you do have postcards on your seats that you found there. Please feel free to share your thoughts about whether they're positive or negative, whatever, and send those postcards out. And you can put those in the shoebox at the Coalition for Liveable Sudbury's table. If you'd like to share your thoughts with the Sudbury Council or a candidate, is that what that says? Or candidates on this or any other issue, fill in the ballot and put it in the white ballot box at the back of the same table. Also, of course, you're invited to take the information sheets on your table. We're inviting you afterwards to stay and chat with the panelists, have some snacks, and ask any more questions that you feel that you need to ask. And now I have one last question for everybody on the panel. It should be a simple question. There is no such thing. But obviously, I don't want you to go on too long because people people are getting a little tired, I think. So, my final question is, would you be comfortable having this facility less than 2 kilometers from your home after all of it you've heard? And I'm going to start.
Again. That's of course is a great question. So 2 kilometers, that seems quite close. I think that overall, you know, as Charles mentioned already, given that there's good environmental monitoring on-site and off-site and controlled by different parties with the technology that's available, the risk is, in my view, low. But again, the primary concern is weather conditions and then essentially exhaust and dust would be my prime concern. And then of course living just within 1 kilometer and 2 kilometers away from the site, that may have some effect on some days. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword for me, and I can't really give a clear answer. I think it's possible to have it safe, but you never know. Accidents can happen, spills can happen.
I don't think I'm qualified to get a job in a smelter, so I'm going to say no. The other thing is, you know, yes, the plant itself may be as safe as we could possibly get it, but like all those trucks coming through, I mean, yeah, I'm not into it. Thanks.
I'm really glad to see like all the people who came out to voice their concerns from their community, because I know like for us we feel the same way, and we go through our own environmental assessment processes in our community. We have our environmental team, and one of the major risk assessment measurables is proximity, and obviously 2 kilometers is very, very close, and that's something that we would be really concerned about. And also, so we do go through our own process, as well as there's in the environmental assessment process, there is a section for traditional use studies, and that's what we do in our department. Is we go out and we do some baseline studies for some of our medicines and some of our practices that we do, just so we can understand how they'll be impacted over time, and we do consistent monitoring with any industry that's happening in our territory, so that we're able to find the patterns of ways that we have been impacted or are likely to be impacted. So yeah, definitely I would say I probably wouldn't be supportive of it being so close to me. So good.
I don't know if people are really aware of how big the facility is going to be. It's pretty much going to be the size of Coniston. So again, just the noise, light, you know, transportation on our rail lines. And if it's on the Highway 17, what's it going to do to highways that are already deteriorating? Also, there's some lingonberry juice over there. Feel free to help yourself. In Finland, the lingonberries are contaminated with chromium, so enjoy.
I'd have to say, from my experience, that appropriate siting for industrial activities is the most important decision that can be made. You avoid all kinds of problems if you make sure that residential areas are treated like residential areas, and industrial areas are treated like industrial areas. 2 kilometers seems pretty close to me.
No, I would not be comfortable. I love where I live. I love my home. I've been there a long time. My kids have grown up there, are still growing up there. So I think if this facility was sited 2 kilometers from me, I would not leave my home for it, but I'd be really mad about it. And I'd really try to keep it out. And if I didn't keep it out, I'd watch it like a hawk. And not let anything go by.
Okay, so I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on a Saturday afternoon. I know it's not sunny out there, but you made it out here in the snow, which is great. Again, I would like to thank our panelists for all the work that they put into answering our questions and the consideration and thoughtfulness that they took to help us to put this together. I would obviously like to thank Coalition for Liveable Sudbury, who organized this event. I'm just facilitating it. They did all the work to put this together, and they do lots of work in this community to keep us informed and to keep us safe and to keep Sudbury more livable. So I would also like to thank them very much. So I invite you all to come and share some snacks and to ask more questions and to have more chats. And yes?
I'm Councillor Deborah.
Okay.
Coniston is in my ward, and I want to thank the Coalition for Liveable Sudbury. You did a fabulous job. And Madam Moderator, you didn't introduce yourself. Oh, sorry. So you were wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for coming out. This was a really great session.
Thank you very much.
So just a couple reminders before everyone gets up. This is a lot of information. There's a lot of research. There are paper copies at the back. Please take them for yourself and anyone who might be interested. There are PDF copies online where you can access the original sources. So if you want to read more, there's a lot of opportunity to do so. Also, just reminding people that No Ferrochrome Sudbury did want to invite people to come by tomorrow at 1 p.m. if they wanted to talk further. And finally, anyone who came by cab, make sure you come find us. We'll make sure you have a ride home.